I played The Last of Us for the first time a couple months ago. I never had a PS3 and only recently got a PS4, so it took me a while to get around to it. From the outside, it never interested me, and I always had this idea that it wouldn't live up to the hype and be a little underwhelming. I could have never been more wrong. The Last of Us is everything storytelling in a game should and can be. It's filled with memorable moments, a rich cast of characters that develop over the course of the game, and leaves the player with a dilemma that still has fans debating over 7 years later. Though, that's common knowledge, and there's a general consensus that The Last of Us is one of the greatest games ever created. I don't necessarily agree with that statement, as I feel the game has its own set of problems, but from a purely storytelling perspective, it succeeds in almost every manner. So naturally, you'd assume the sequel would garner the same praise, hell, maybe more. But damn, if this isn't one of the most controversial and divisive games I have witnessed in my lifetime. Diehard fans of the franchise left feeling betrayed, with the Metacritic user score getting review bombed daily. It almost seems as if the general consensus for Part 2 is, it's terrible? So then why? Well, the entirety of the internet agrees the game is trash. Do I love it? Well, there's a lot to it, and I got a lot to say. By the time the credits had rolled, I was left staring at the title screen, preferring Part 2 over the first title. This is The Last of Us Part 2, a critical look. The Last of Us Part 2 opens seemingly right along the end of the first game. Joel recaps the events that had taken place at the Fireflies and explains to Tommy just what exactly went down. After heading back to Jackson, the settlement they now reside in, Joel goes to check in on Ellie. Things are a little awkward, though it's here where Joel sings Future Days for Ellie. She'd always wanted him to perform for her, so it's a nice act to see. And with that, Joel gives Ellie a guitar, with the promise to teach her how to play. This moment leaves its mark and echoes throughout the entire game. Fast forward 4 years, and here we are, where the game really begins. We're introduced to two important characters, Jesse and Dina, recently separated partners, both being close friends of Ellie. Ellie and Dina are set to leave for patrols, mostly to clear out the infected and protect the town. It's here where perspectives switch, and we're also introduced to Abby and Owen, characters that play pivotal roles in the plot. They talk about luring someone out of town as they look above Jackson. Before playing the game, when I was unboxing my special edition, this character appeared on the steelbook. Keep in mind, I had no idea about anything really. I tried to go in about as blind as possible. I thought she was possibly a long-lost relative of Ellie, at least here they looked similar. That was about as far from the truth as you could get. We're then in this period of switching between Ellie and Dina on patrol, and Abby slowly working her way closer towards Jackson. With Ellie, we piece together her relationship with Joel at this time isn't the greatest. Eventually, on patrol, the pair come across an underground weed garden, and this is where we really get to see their relationship at its fullest. While they're off making out and such, we see Abby almost get killed by an ambush of infected, only for Joel and Tommy to save her. They make their way back to the mansion where the rest of Abby's friends are held up in, only for the big moment of her to, oh shit, shotgun Joel's leg and then beat him with a golf club. Ellie makes her way to the house, only to be pinned down alongside Tommy to watch the group brutally murder Joel. Now, this is the action that sets off the entire events of the game, but it's also one of, if not the first place, many seem to take issue with. The two main complaints I see are Joel and Tommy aren't that stupid to give out their names, essentially putting their safety at risk, and that Joel's death somehow disrespected the character or wasn't earned. Look, it's totally acceptable to dislike this or any part of the game, and it's especially okay to be upset over it, as I think anyone would be. That's kind of the point, but I do find these two arguments to be a little flat. Firstly, of course Joel and Tommy shouldn't have given up their names like that, and they certainly wouldn't have in the previous game. The thing is, they've been living safely in a settlement for years now, and naturally they're going to let their guard down. That's the realistic essence of things. There's a flashback later in the game where it said Jackson has only lost 2 people beyond natural causes, and that's due to them leaving on their own accord. The other criticism is that Joel's death isn't respectful to the character or the fans. I guess people wanted Joel to go out in some heroic manner, but that's not entirely realistic. Oh, and don't tell me it's a game about zombies, realism doesn't matter. People tend to use the argument of, well, because it's a game, they shouldn't account for that, or try to tell stories grounded in reality, yet they never use the same rebuttal for other pieces of fiction such as television. Within the world of The Last of Us and hell, any post-apocalyptic setting, characters should not be expected to go out in a heroic way or any matter. It's a grounded story, and just like real life, people can and will die in many ways, often in such you won't be too happy about. I'm not trying to speak for anyone, though I feel a lot of the hate towards this scene and the game in general is due to each and every fan having crafted a particular way the story would play out over the past 7 years. Maybe it's just me, but even going in blind, I fully expected Joel to die. It's a zombie apocalypse story. If you went into this game expecting Joel to live happily ever after, you're simply out of your mind. I don't necessarily want to draw comparisons to The Walking Dead, as I think it's a significantly worse story than The Last of Us, at least later on, but within The Walking Dead, so many fan favorite characters die all the time. Often it's in ways you may not like. That's the cost of the setting. It's what drives the story forward and gets characters to gain motives. Negan killed Glenn, and most people were upset about it, but that's how shit happens in a zombie apocalypse. In no way should you have expected Joel to die in the most extravagant or lush way possible. Death is death, and realistically, it doesn't ever happen the way you want it to. We're then back in Jackson, where Ellie and Tommy discuss what plan of action to take going forward. Where Tommy disagrees, Ellie insists they pursue Abby and her group the Wolves to take revenge. Tommy reluctantly agrees to help get Ellie on her way, with hopefully a team of people and some supplies. The next day, Ellie and Dina are paying respects at Joel's grave, and it's also here where we get to see Joel's house. As the player, you can look around and really discover the place Joel's been at the past few years. He's got a drawing from Ellie, he had obviously been taking up woodworking, and as well had a nice collection of guitars. There's honestly loads of small details crammed within this location, with pieces like the dinosaur brochure that you later learn about more. You're eventually called downstairs to speak with Maria, where you learn Tommy set out to avenge Joel himself. Maria is obviously frustrated, though hesitantly sets off Ellie and Dina with one of the horses. Now I know I said before, but the game really begins. But this is where the game really begins. It's at this point where Ellie and Dina's journey to kill Abby, avenge Joel, and find Tommy is truly set in motion. I know that was a lot of story to cover, but I feel it's needed for context in regards to gameplay and the entire video from here on out. With that all out of the way, we can begin to discuss other aspects of the game. One of the most noticeable things that will catch your eye right away is the visuals. Naughty Dog has always been a leader in visual fidelity, and right when you think they couldn't top Uncharted 4, they outdo themselves again. It's amazing to see these kind of graphics being pushed out by the PS4, and it really shows what benefits mastering your hard work can bring. The mountains in the distance and lush green forests within this game are gorgeous. Each landscape you make your way through is prettier than the last. The only disappointment in this field is the amount of film grain they poured on this title. Why the hell do developers love this shit? Beyond that, the performances are top notch and what really sell the characters in this game, along with some incredible animation of course. The game is about as lifelike as you can possibly get when it comes to visuals, and might just be the most graphically impressive game I've played to date. Gameplay wise, The Last of Us Part 2 is very similar to its predecessor, while making some vital changes and welcome additions to elevate the experience. Level design is an area I feel had one of the best upgrades and care put into. Each section of this game feels more expansive, and levels are laid out not to be hallways or straight paths anymore. One of the best examples is right off the start as Ellie and Dina try to make it over this wall. There's also a great emphasis on breakable windows and exploring places you might not have thought you were able to. The game feels more inspired by the level design of Uncharted, while not diminishing its own reality for the sake of better design. It's really a great mix. Of course, the game is still linear, but each environment feels different from the last, and makes them immensely more enjoyable to explore compared to the first game. Because of this, one of the game's main mechanics, I feel, benefits greatly, that being scavenging for resources and ammo. In the first game, it always felt tacked on and dull, and while it's not amazing here by any means, it's still a lot better. Back to the expansiveness of the levels. Early on during day 1 of Seattle, you come across this semi-open world stretch of land. You're trying to find gas for a generator, so you ride Shimmer around scavenging what you can. There's plenty of interesting details and goodies to be found that really build up the game. Hell, that can be said for the entirety of the title. I personally really enjoyed this section and was looking forward to more, but beyond this there weren't any to be found. While I know The Lost Legacy did something similar and on a more grand scale, it's nice to see Naughty Dog try a more open-ended design with its narrative-focused games, while also knowing when to pull it back to be in service of the story. The trend in games for years has been open worlds, and often I feel they do a disservice or don't mix well enough to be warranted in narrative-driven games. Of course, there are those titles that do it right, but overall it's not such a perfected design. This also seems like a great time to go over the guitar scenes in the game, as there is one within Seattle, and they do play a major role within the story. The first one was with Joel as he sang to Ellie in the opening, but throughout your journey you'll find guitars that you can play. They almost remind me of Ocarina of Time. You'll strum a couple chords and then a cutscene playing, the whole song will act out. They're just so beautiful. Maybe I'm a sucker for this stuff, but I love it. Puzzles have been altered significantly. There's no ladders and no pallets in this game. There are, however, ropes, which I feel are a lot better of a mechanic. The design around them is usually pretty interesting, far more so than anything in the previous game, and sometimes you can get creative with it. There's this section as you're heading towards the aquarium where you're climbing up a worn down train and need to get to the other blocked off room. With the rope you can either throw it outside and swing across, or climb up and drop in through a window above. Little things, but welcome nonetheless. Throughout the game, Ellie jots down things in her journal, and it's really a great deep dive into her mental state, and if read by the player, I feel garners deep appreciation. I only wish it would have come as a complete booklet in one of the collector's editions to have a physical version with all the little sketches and notes. I guess we should talk about the meat and potatoes of the gameplay, that being combat, and along with it, stealth. The first game had a focus on combat and tried to pull off stealth, but didn't accomplish the greatest results. This all changes with part 2. The addition of the ability to go prone along with better AI and being designed around it makes stealth a must, and it actually works pretty well. There was always limited ammo before, and the sequel is no different, meaning you're simply not going to rush in guns blazing. Each bullet counts, and you're going to have to end up using bricks and bottles to your advantage. What's great is, if you get caught, you're really able to disguise yourself and go from having everyone on your ass to being safe again. The problem with that is, there's no reason to, as the pause menu gives you an option to restart from the last checkpoint, often being right before you get caught, resulting those times not feeling as a threat. Stealth kills are also back for when you sneak up on an enemy, and boy are they slow and gruesome this time around. Maybe it's just me, but I felt as if it took twice the amount of time as the first game in this regard. It's not a bad thing though, as it really shows how grim the world is, especially against humans as they choke on their own blood and you hear them die. Of course, Ellie has an array of weapons at her disposal, each with their strengths and weaknesses. You can upgrade them at any workbenches with the bullets you find, and one of the coolest additions is the ability to craft a silencer for your pistol. Along with that, you can create explosive arrows and other things to help you in combat. Actually, when you first find the bow, a little cutscene plays out, and there's a section for some target practice, which I found nice, as it is Ellie's signature weapon. You can even craft arrows in this game, which is such a great addition. Apart from your own efforts in combat, you'll also sometimes have a partner to help out too. In the beginning of the game, it's Dina, who I found cool regardless, but with the improvements in partner AI, it made me love her even more. Unlike Ellie in the first game, partners actually do things and help out. The first time Dina killed a clicker for me, I was shocked. It felt nice to not just have some useless husk alongside me in firefights. This trait continues through the whole game with many of the different partners you'll have. Now the game has primarily 2 types of enemies, much like the first, those being the infected and the humans. The humans are pretty self-explanatory, being similar to the first game, yet with better AI. These are the guys that are smart and will have you thinking out your actions before going ahead. The infected are also similar to the last game. You have the runners, typical zombies, stalkers who are quick and nimble, clickers you have to be quiet around, as well as the bloaters, the tanks when it comes to the infected. With The Last of Us Part 2, we're also introduced to shamblers, who are similar in their brute force to bloaters, though also emit enormous amounts of spores. Outside of these 2 types of enemies, there really isn't anything else to fight. I mean, sure, the humans usually come in the form of wolf soldiers or the scars Ellie hears about through a quest, though they act very similar for the most part. Really, the only other creature you'll sometimes fight are dogs. Yes, you have to kill some dogs in the game, and as sad as that is, these boys are vicious, man. The game also has some great ways of keeping you engaged and catching you off guard during gameplay. The workbenches are usually seen as a safety spot, but there's one moment where you're using it as normal and a wolf soldier attacks you as you get ambushed. Moments like this happen throughout the game, with infected shedding from the walls or jumping at you while sliding through corridors. I really think it just adds to the immersion. What I will say about this game that's not amazing is the actual performance of the title. During my first playthrough and second after the most recent patch, I experienced many issues and cases of pop-in. I'll attribute that mostly to being the PS4's old hardware at this point in time, but even while playing on my PlayStation 4 Pro, it was very common. Beyond that, I also experienced issues like Ellie having troubles to get into this boat, or whatever this is with Abby. Hopefully issues like these will be resolved with the inevitable PS5 remaster, as these are just blemishes that should really be ironed out. I'd also love to see this game in 60 frames per second. Ugh, it would just be so amazing. Let's wind it back to the story now, as there's still plenty to talk about and get through. At this point in Seattle, Ellie's main goal is to find and kill Abby by any means necessary. You'll be following any leads found and killing as many wolves needed along the way. The main plotline is kill one of Abby's friends, find a lead, kill more of Abby's friends, find more leads, until eventually you reach her. Now that is summarizing it an awful lot, as there's plenty of deep and interesting moments that happen in between and honestly through the entire journey. One of the main sections that I feel almost everyone likes, even if you're not a fan of the game, are the flashback sequences, the first of which happens as you arrive at the theater. Actually, the theater in general is quite an interesting and important location within the story. You first reach it after being chased by some wolves, and along the way, Dina's mask breaks as they're treading through a spore-infested area. Of course, Ellie hands off her mask to save Dina, which leaves her flustered. She doesn't know Ellie is immune, and it kinda creates this weird dynamic between them for a little as Dina tries to process it. At the same time, Dina seems to be getting more and more sick, which Ellie had noticed for a while. Turns out, she's pregnant, which makes it even more weird and legitimately difficult for Ellie, as it becomes progressively more tough for Dina to even stay on her feet. This all happens just before and as you arrive at the theater. Mainly due to the pregnancy, Ellie and Dina decide to set up camp within the theater, allowing for Dina to rest. One of the most interesting details I found within the building was when Ellie picks up a program for the upcoming Cassandra show. She says,
"How many people die in this play?"
Obviously quite a bit of foreshadowing and theming to do with the game right there. So, let's return to the flashback scenes. The first one begins with Ellie playing guitar, as several do, then transitions to 3 years earlier. Everyone loves these flashbacks as they're what people wanted. Ellie and Joel's relationship, everything that was loved about the first game. So, it's Ellie's birthday and Joel's gotten her a gift. You see, Joel's even taught Ellie how to swim. They arrive at a museum in which the pair gets to see some statues of dinosaurs, which is just great. Even better is that Joel, knowing how much Ellie adores space, has gotten her a cassette with the sounds of a launch for when they're in a tip of a rocket, space helmet included. It all adds up to being a phenomenal scene, one that I'd say almost everyone loves. The next flashback is one in which Tommy is teaching Ellie to shoot with his rifle, as well as Joel helping her find new strings for her guitar. Both of these scenes are great, but they also play with the fact that Ellie is still unsure about the Fireflies and what happened, showing her guilt and doubts in both scenes. After first reaching the theater, Ellie heads out again to follow a lead, this time on her own. On her way we meet up with Jesse, as he tells Ellie he'd been following them since the day after they left, and was here to help. After some intense gunfights, Ellie and Jesse make it back to the theater and check in with Dina. Ellie leaves the theater again, this time in search of Nora, who was located at the Wolves Hospital. She was one of the people within Abby's group as Joel was killed. This is one of the longer stretches of the game, but there was never a dull moment. I always had felt excited. This is also the first in which you come across the Seraphites, the actual name for what the Wolves had been referring to as the Scars. Seraphites are pretty terrifying. They're basically a cult, following some woman who had been preaching the outbreak happened due to humanity's sins. The Seraphites are also very anti-electricity, and use mostly bows and melee weapons, but there are exceptions as you'll see later. Due to this, many of them rely on stealth, and while they are pretty similar to other humans in the game, there are some slight differences. These guys are also just so gruesome. The first time you come across them, they're even hanging someone in the woods. Ellie eventually makes her way to the hospital, and after chasing down Nora, one of the most tense and captivating moments occurs. Nora says,
"Think about what he did,"
which causes another and probably the most significant flashback. You see, before Joel dies and the game really gets going, we're shown that Joel and Ellie's relationship in the current isn't so great. She barely talks to him, but it seems she is starting to lighten up to the idea of rebuilding their relationship. Now within the flashback, I'm super tense. As it starts, the player still thinks that Ellie has no idea about the truth in regards to the Fireflies base. It's this weird thing that just keeps playing over in my head. Is she gonna find out and then this whole quest to avenge Joel will just change? We then learn that Ellie had gone back to the Fireflies base 2 years beforehand, found a cassette, and learned the truth about what had happened. She demands Joel tell her the events that really took place, and it's at this point where she says,
"But we're done."
"It's sad, because of course the relationship broke due to it, but I'm also so relieved Joel did eventually tell Ellie the truth. When first playing the game, at least for me, it was a real shocker moment. I mean, through the entirety of your playthrough up to this point, it's thought that Ellie doesn't know, so it's scary to think of what she'll do when she does learn. But turns out, she always knew. She still goes out to avenge Joel and deeply cares for him, even if they weren't on great terms. Ellie kills Nora in a pretty brutal fashion to boot, and I think this is a great time to pitch in about another controversy I see. Many people seem to be upset that as the player you have to kill all these people, or will say, the game forces you to do all these horrendous acts. Well, of course it does. The Last of Us is not a series about choice. It's a specifically written narrative told in the form of a video game. It is not an RPG. There is no room for player decisions here. It's not your story, it's Ellie's. Even if you don't agree or wouldn't perform that act, as many wouldn't, it doesn't invalidate the game or story. Just because you wouldn't do something doesn't mean the game has to adhere to that. It'd be like shitting on Breaking Bad because you don't agree with Walt's decisions. It just doesn't make sense. From this point forward, Ellie and Jesse set out to find Tommy and return to Jackson. Dina isn't doing so great and she clearly needs help, so it seems to be the best course of action to take. Though eventually, as they're making their way to the aquarium, where Abby is supposedly located and Tommy might be, they learn Tommy is at a nearby marina. Jesse and Ellie argue over what to do and go their separate ways, with Ellie still pursuing the aquarium to find Abby. It's at this point the game feels as though it's wrapping up. You make your way to the aquarium after fighting through some waves of enemies and this cool boat section. It's there where Ellie finds Owen and Mel, kills them after they refuse to tell Abby's whereabouts, and then naturally has a mental breakdown as she finds out Mel was pregnant. Everything is so tense here, but Tommy and Jesse bust in to take Ellie back to the theater and return to Jackson. Everything seems okay, almost too much. Of course, Abby makes her way into the theater, shoots and kills Jesse, kicks Tommy to the ground, and leaves Ellie defenseless. This is really the moment where most people, at least on their first playthrough, will feel as the climax. The first Last of Us was not that long of a game, and at this point it feels part 2 is reaching the end. Abby has her gun pointed at Ellie, we can tell everything is about to go to shit, and then this happens. The game switches perspectives to now play as Abby. We're shown a flashback of Abby and her father in the woods, and eventually we learn that they are part of the Fireflies. Abby's father, Jerry, is actually the lead doctor in charge of creating a cure for the infected. This whole flashback plays just at the tail end of the first game. We're even shown Marlene and get a better idea of how she really didn't want to go through with the surgery either, but did so for the greater of mankind. Marlene really cared for Ellie. Now, of course we know Joel kills the lead doctor, who turns out to be Jerry, and that's why Abby had killed Joel. Her dad got killed, so she goes after the person who caused that death. Ellie takes the same actions later. I think a lot of people, myself included, thought this would be a flashback and we'd return to the action of the scene prior, but no, we keep playing as Abby. We play through Seattle Day 1, 2, and 3 through Abby's view, and this is another part that a lot of people seem to be critical of. You see Abby in the wolf's perspective, and even see a lot of the characters you kill in the first half of the game, and what they were doing leading up to those events. Abby's story basically revolves, at least for the first half, around finding Owen, as he's gone missing. She talks to Isaac, who's the wolf leader, to try and get some help, but he's too focused on the raging battle between the wolves and Seraphites, and how to put a stop to it. Abby sets off for the aquarium, as that's where she presumes he's held up at, and her story begins. Now, one thing I've noticed with Abby and Ellie's stories is that they're very similar in aspects. They both lose their fathers, witness many of their friends die, and at one point or another are acting on a very similar level. This is clearly done with intention to show even though Ellie and Abby hate each other, they aren't so different from one another. Now, the game really tries to get you to care for Abby, showing flashbacks and her relationships with many characters. The only problem is, every player hates Abby for what she did to Joel. In fact, I was loving the game up until this part. Not because it was bad now, but because I didn't want to play as her, and it felt though Naughty Dog wanted me to become attached to someone that just wasn't going to happen. That is, until Yara and Lev are introduced, who basically save the second half of the game, or more so allow Naughty Dog to pull off what they were going for. At a point, Abby is knocked out and then hung in the forest by some Seraphites. Just as a member is about to carve into Abby's stomach, the game introduces Yara. She's a member of the Seraphites, but the rest of the group seems to disown her and ask about another Yara is with. She refuses, so the group tortures and breaks her arm. It's pretty brutal. Lev then comes shooting them down and saves Yara, who's his sister. Now, usually Seraphites and wolves are mortal enemies, but Abby strangled the leader to death as she was trying to kill Yara, effectively saving her life. The three team up and eventually reach a safe spot where Yara can rest, and it's here where they go their separate ways. Abby is very close to the aquarium here, and she continues to make her way in that direction. Along this section is also where we receive one of the coolest weapons in the game, the crossbow. I hadn't spoken about Abby's gameplay yet, as she plays close enough to Ellie, but there are some differences. Abby plays a lot closer to Joel over Ellie. She has access to shivs instead of a knife, and gets the flamethrower while Ellie doesn't. That's one of the big differences between the two. It's their access to what weapons and loadout they each have. Now, back to the point I was getting at. The crossbow is just amazing. It does as you think, acting like the bow, being quiet and great for stealth kills, but with the benefit of having no charge needed. It also has a much higher chance of arrow recovery compared to the normal bow. While we're distanced from the story for just a bit, I'd like to talk about two other aspects of the game as well. The first being notes. On both sides of the game, you come across many, and I mean many notes from people way back at the start of the outbreak writing to their families and loved ones. Some players will read them, some won't, but it really makes you think about if Joel's actions from the first game was the right choice. I mean, obviously it's hard to let go of another daughter, let alone one, but the amount of notes in this game showing people whose lives have been affected by something that had a possible stop to it is kind of insane. Okay, the other thing was the soundtrack. It can be kind of hard to speak on the music within a game, but The Last of Us Part 2 has such an amazing score. Gustavo and Mac do such a great job in complementing one another's musical style, and it serves the game tremendously. While Gustavo brings that guitar, banjo, and strings we all love from the first game, Mac delivers a more synth-heavy and dark atmosphere that parallels the beauty the instruments provide for the other parts of the soundtrack. The sound effects in the game are also just on another level. Examples are like when you hear Yara's bones get smashed, or the choking of one's blood when killing enemies. It all just augments the brutality within the game. Time to get back to things. Abby arrives at the aquarium, argues with Owen for a sec, and then proceeds to have hot, steamy... I don't have much to speak on when it comes to this issue, and yes, that's in quotation marks, because I don't really see what the problem is. Movies have sex scenes all the time, and nobody makes a big deal or complains. The game is rated M, it can have something like this. It's barely like 5 seconds, get over it. What I will say is I find it stupid how Sony will censor other games or sexual content, but not their own. That's just not okay. But overall, I don't have any inherent problem with sex scenes in video games. This feels like something parents would complain about to try and get video games banned, but it's coming from within the gaming community. Now, Abby has a nightmare about Yara and Lev hanging in the forest, as she did. So the next day, she rushes back to where they split up in hopes of rescuing them and bringing them back to the aquarium before the Seraphites get to the two. The three of them return and Mel is there with Owen? Now, I hadn't brought this up before, but while Abby and Owen had seen each other at one point, they were now broken up, and Owen was with Mel. This makes things a little awkward between the three, but it's not really that important. What is more important is the fact that Mel is a field medic, and is able to take a look at Yara's arm, as it's still not doing well. They get a list of supplies needed, and Lev takes Abby along a shortcut to reach the Wolf's hospital and get the meds. This is the second half or so of Abby's story. Abby develops a relationship and bond with Yara and Lev, in which she feels the need to protect both, and a lot of people will point out the parallels to Joel's story within the first game. Obviously, it isn't nearly as developed as the bond between Joel and Ellie, but you really begin to care for Yara and even more so Lev. This in turn doesn't make it so you love Abby, but somewhat has you develop an attachment to her character after seeing her help these kids. That's what I meant earlier by Yara and Lev really making the second half of this game. Without them, while many still do, I personally would have hated playing as Abby and going through this whole part of the game. Yara and Lev are actually some of the most interesting characters within the game. They're scars, so they really should be mortal enemies with Abby, but they're two of the few characters that show you don't need to be stuck in your ways and can overcome differences with others to create peace in this universe, unlike almost any other character in the game. So, Abby and Lev make their way to the hospital by means of a shortcut the Seraphites have. They've built these large bridges way in the sky where the clouds block as a way to travel without wolves noticing them. We get to see more of Abby's character here and how she's frightened to death by heights. Meanwhile, Lev takes them on like a champ. The two eventually reach the hospital where Abby has Lev wait outside as he's a scar and the wolves would just kill him on sight. The hospital is a pretty great section of the game, and probably the most enjoyable part up to this point within Abby's story. We get to see Whitney, the Vita girl, and have some interactions with Nora too. This whole part takes place just before Ellie arrives and causes havoc. Now, when Abby arrives at the hospital, things seem fine at first, although the guards then lock her up as they got a call from Isaac saying she had gone AWOL. Nora lets her go to get the supplies needed, but the only part of the hospital not raided yet was covered in heavy amounts of spores and infected. Abby finds a med kit, but it's also here where we're presented to one of, if not our only boss fight within the game. Meet the Rat King, a new type of infected introduced in part 2 you only encounter here. It's basically an amalgamation of stalkers, clickers, and a bloater that somehow fused to create an abomination of a creature. The Rat King is really the closest we get to a boss fight in this game. It's immensely strong with incredible stamina, and the battle all takes place within the small corridors of a basement hospital floor. You run around shooting the thing and doing what you can to survive until eventually infected will separate from the being that you'll also have to deal with. It can be a lot, but the fight in general is pretty cool and terrifying too. I really felt overwhelmed during this fight, like I had no power against this thing. Having successfully gotten the meds, Lev and Abby return to the aquarium, and luckily it seems Yara will be able to recover, albeit without her one arm. We now begin Seattle Day 3. Everything seems calm and alright as Abby wakes up, but we're quickly shown that Yara and Lev are taking part in a heated argument. It's not really known why, but Yara asks Abby to help look for Lev as he had run off. During the time looking for Lev, Yara lets something be known and tells Abby what had happened. Lev wants to return to their home island to bring their mother along with them, but Yara knows that that will only cause trouble. The reason the Seraphites disowned and are now after Yara and Lev is due to Lev shaving his head, at least that's what Abby was aware of. Yara explains Lev used to be known as Lily and was born a girl. Lev had always struggled with his identity and opened himself up to Yara, where she had first shut him down and told him to reject his inner feelings. He tried to suppress them, but the Seraphites had lined him up to become a wife to one of the elders, and he was no longer able to take it. He started identifying himself as a male, shaved his head, and renamed himself to Lev. All of this defiance led him to flee the Seraphites for his life, with Yara tagging along. She began to truly see how upset and uncomfortable Lev was with his identity beforehand, and she had to do everything she could to be there for him. This is why the Seraphites were after them, and Yara explains that their mother in no way would be able to take them back, and if she saw Lev, would probably kill him. Now, it's not everyone, but there are quite a few reviews and criticisms of the game I've personally noticed when it comes to Lev and some LGBT aspects of the game. People that are saying this game is SJW bullshit or pandering are insane. These characters are fully developed people with feelings. Things like Lev's gender or Dina and Ellie's relationship aren't just shoved in your face or there for nothing. It is full and realized representation, which, in my opinion, is amazing to see in a AAA game like this. It doesn't happen often. There's such a varied cast as well, with so many cultures and ethnicities. People saying Ellie and Dina making out is pandering are just out of their mind. They'll say it's just there to represent them when it didn't need to be, but wouldn't say a thing if it was a heterosexual relationship being shown. People that are genuinely mad over LGBT representation are just ridiculous in my opinion. Did you play the first game? Did you miss Bill's character? Or the Left Behind DLC? This isn't new territory when it comes to The Last of Us. We continue to search for Lev within the aquarium, but soon the group sees him take off with one of the boats towards the Seraphites' home island, in hopes of bringing back their mother. Knowing this will only turn out bad, Yara and Abby head to the nearby marina to get a boat and go after him, while Owen and Mel stay put to finish up the sailboat and get ready to leave when they return. Only to be killed soon after. The marina, if you remember, is where Tommy was supposedly located at that time. You arrive there only to be saved from oncoming fire by Manny. He explains the wolves are gathering boats to head to the island as well, as it's the night they've decided to rampage the Scars. Now, moments like these are really interesting if you pay attention and connect the dots. It's pretty clear the sniper fire is from Tommy, especially if you remember Jesse saying he was located there, but it's also cool to see the sniper moment and its connections to other things. For one, it feels very much like a parallel to a similar sniper scene within Part 1, further connecting Abby and Joel. Besides that, in an earlier flashback with Ellie, you'll recall Tommy teaching her on how to use his sniper rifle and snipe infected from afar, a nice callback to events prior and attention to detail. This whole section plays out just as you'd think it would, hiding behind cover, running to the next spot, trying not to get shot. There are, however, some infected within this area as a nice change of pace, and let me go over that for a second. This game is not human vs. disaster like the first one, it's human vs. human. Both as Ellie and Abby, you kill and witness the deaths of so many humans. You must kill 10 times the amount of human life over infected in this one, a complete opposite of the little but still present amount of bandits in the first game. You kill hundreds, even thousands of human enemies throughout the game. It is very, very gruesome, and at times hard to play because of that. But that's really the point of it all. It's to show that while there's a disaster in the forms of the infected going on within the world, that really isn't the biggest issue at hand. It's one another and the wars that happen between groups of people in times of crisis, instead of the connections that would so help them. You'll eventually reach the sniper after he shoots Manny in the face, much like Abby later does to Jesse, and after an intense brawl on the docks above the ocean, push him off into the rushing waters. For a second, Abby is in shock as she realizes just who it was, but immediately turns her attention as Yara and her head off to the island. The Seraphites' home island is definitely one of the most intriguing and beautiful landscapes within the game. They're a civilization that relies very little on electricity or guns for the most part. All of their houses are old-fashioned log cabins lit by oil lanterns or fireplaces. You'll run through cornfields and rolling hills as you make your way towards Lev. When you finally do reach Lev, things aren't so great. He had to kill their own mother as she came after him, and clearly this has left him in a state of distraught. Yara promises Lev everything will be okay, but trust me, things only get worse from here. The three make their way to escape when they come across Isaac and the wolves who shoot Yara on sight. Abby and Lev are surrounded, and while things don't look too good as Isaac gears up to shoot Lev with her last breath, Yara shoots and kills Isaac, buying enough time for the pair to run off. They barricade themselves within a room, and you can tell Lev is just broken at this point. He claims,
"We're your fucking people."
to which Abby replies,
"You're my people."
This is the moment in which I really went from hating Abby to kinda liking her and becoming attached. I've said it before, but while Abby hated Joel, her story plays out very similarly to Joel's within part 1. She grows so close to Lev and leaves behind her old ways and group for the innocence of a kid. From this point forward, the pair's only goal is to reach the docks and get a boat to leave the island. It's pretty interesting to see this section play out as Abby and Lev both fight off Seraphites and the Wolves, groups that they once belonged to. As you get closer to the docks and the most populated section of the island, you really get to see the battle between the Seraphites and Wolves take off. Buildings are on fire, people are killing each other left and right. It wouldn't be surprising to see neither group make it out of this one. While everything's burning and the devastation scene takes place, this whole area also makes for one of the most visually engaging and stunning set pieces within any game I've played. It's freaking eye candy. You'll eventually make your way to the docks, get a boat, and set off, and it's here where you get a really good look at just what kind of battle is taking place on the island. It's devastating yet beautiful. Now Abby and Lev make their way back to the aquarium, and it's finally all catching up to where we just left off with Ellie. They enter and see Alice dead on the floor, which is very sad. I mean, Alice was such a good little dog. They rush to the main room, and there's Owen and Mel also lifeless on the ground. Abby is really taking it hard, but Lev finds and shows her a map left behind by Ellie, pointing them into the direction of the theater. It doesn't take long for Abby and Lev to get to and within the theater. At this point, I'm pretty sure Abby is only aware of Tommy's presence and is expecting him as they make their way down. She holds him up, and what we see play out is a continuation of what occurred at the first half's end. Abby shoots Jesse blank in the face and fires at Ellie, with her then coming out and explaining she knows why Abby killed Joel. Abby says Ellie wasted her life, of which was spared, and then we're shown what had originally cut to black. Tommy tackles Abby as she fires once again at Ellie, which then leads her to shoot Tommy in the back of the head as Ellie makes a break for it. We're finally back at the climax we'd all been at the edge of our seat for. I know some take issue with the pacing of the game, and specifically these two halves with how we thought we'd see the end, but then had to play through an entire section just to get back to where we were, but I didn't find it to be a problem at all. I really enjoyed the parallels in the storytelling and getting to see exactly what state of mind both these characters were at leading up to the events in the end. Now, we're still playing as Abby. We have to chase Ellie and fight her in what's a similar boss fight, if you'd call it that, to what was in the first game with David. Ellie's hunting you down as you stay silent and approach her from behind. Naughty Dog's never really had phenomenal boss design, especially in their narrative games, and I don't even know if they want typical video game bosses within their titles. You go through several phases of these fights until eventually you have Ellie pinned down. I was very tense here and struggled to push through because I was scared of the outcome. Abby's beating the shit out of her, just slamming her face in. That is until Dina comes slashing her with a knife, which leads Lev to shoot Dina in the shoulder. Right as Abby's about to slice Dina's neck, Ellie pleads and begs for her life, stating,
"She had nothing to do with this.
and
She's pregnant."
the latter of which Abby finds to be particularly baffling as Ellie had just killed Mel, another pregnant woman, only recently. Lev stops Abby before she can proceed with the act, and Abby tells Ellie,
Don't ever let me see you again.
before the game cuts to black. The final act. We focus on a farmhouse for a moment before transitioning to a room housing Ellie. She's looking at Joel's watch and she hears the cries of a child, that being JJ. The house is such a peaceful environment and it's great to look around and see Ellie's drawings and such. For a moment when I first got here I was worried, but you hear Dina humming as Ellie calls her pretty soon after. It's real nice to see the three together here, especially as Dina had mentioned previously that she'd love to settle down in a farmhouse near Jackson someday. Ellie and JJ head outside and damn, if this isn't one of the most beautiful set pieces in the game. The two rest on a tractor watching the sunset, with the wheat blowing in the wind. Everything here just feels so perfect. Your first time though, it feels like this could really be where everything wraps up, but realistically thinking that's just not plausible. We run around a bit herding some sheep, and while things seem fine at first, it all changes fast. A shovel gets knocked over, causing Ellie to have a panic attack as a result of PTSD from Joel's death. She even gets lost in her head reliving that day and course of events happening again. Thankfully, Dina comes quickly to calm her down and be by her side. Not long after, Ellie returns from hunting and sees someone has come to visit. Inside it's revealed to be Tommy, which comes as a major surprise. As the player we see him get shot point blank in the face. Up to this point, I was sure he was gone just as Jesse was. Now, not all is great for Tommy. He's lost his one eye as well as Maria and him splitting up. After some catching up, Tommy sits Ellie down as he kinda has an agenda. He's tracked down Abby's location and while he can't go, pretty much insists Ellie take the task. Of course, Dina doesn't approve, and Ellie herself doesn't seem too fond of the idea either. Tommy gets pissed off and says some hurtful things as he storms away, leaving Ellie to linger on the map left behind. Later that night, as Ellie can't sleep, she gets up and walks around a bit, closes some windows, reads some old journal entries, nothing insane. She eventually picks up and plays her guitar, leading back to a scene that at first I thought was cut. We're finally shown the E3 2018 trailer within the game, the dance room sequence. It was referenced early on within the game, and the events of this scene all take place the night before the game starts. Everything that happens is pretty much the exact same as the trailer before, with the dance and the kiss. However, we do get to see a tiny bit extra. Seth, who we see before apologizing for this event, makes a scene yelling at Dina and calling her a not so pleasant word. Ellie immediately gets in his face when suddenly Joel steps in pushing Seth away. Ellie's not having it with him either though, stating,
I don't need your fucking help, Joel.
as the two go their separate ways. Back to the present, Ellie's packing a bag and preparing to leave, presumably to find Abby. Dina tries talking some sense into her, but it just doesn't work. Ellie claims she can't sleep, eat, or really live with Abby still out there. Ellie thinks that her trauma and problems will either go away or somewhat resolve if she deals with Abby. It's so hard to watch this scene play out. The right decision is clearly to stay, but with the mindset Ellie has, that just isn't possible. Ellie sets off, and even with all her efforts of convincing, Dina is left heartbroken. We then switch over to Santa Barbara and, oh shit, it's Abby and Lev. They made their way over here and are currently searching for the Fireflies through a clue Owen had passed along before his death. They search a few houses and eventually find the address they were looking for. In the basement is where the hideout was located, and after some work, they get a radio set up and try out some frequencies to see if they can reach anyone. It takes a little bit, but Abby does surprisingly come in contact with the Fireflies. They ask some questions to make sure she was once a member, and we learn they're about 200 members strong, currently stationed on Catalina Island. Abby and Lev leave the house to make their way for the base, only to get ambushed by a new group of enemies, the Rattlers. They beat the two up pretty bad, and Abby's left on the ground staring at Lev's cold, knocked out body, before the game transitions once again. We're now back with Ellie, and it's finally time for Act 3 to really kick into gear, with actual gameplay to boot now. She's tracked down Abby to a T, even having the info of the exact address she was looking for in regards to the Fireflies. This section of the game's pretty cool. We get to explore an area and environment brand new to the series, making our way up from a beach to California streets. Along your way you'll do the obvious infected clearing, looting, the usual stuff, until you start getting closer and reach this hill. Ellie makes her way to the bottom and gets caught up in a trap, with a broken branch impaling her side in the process. She blacks out and is later woken up to be greeted by none other than the Rattlers from before. Ellie's in a sorta uneven situation, but manages to turn the tide, killing them both, and getting information about Abby being held in one of the Rattlers' cells. Now, I will say it's surprising for them to add another faction, but I guess it does make sense as they're located in Santa Barbara, and I'm sure there are many different groups of psychopaths all across the globe. Ellie continues to make her way towards Abby, and now the Rattler's base. From killing the two before, we now have the final weapon of the game, the silenced submachine gun. Much like the assault rifle from the first game, this weapon is very strong, but we also don't have much game left to play around with it. It does as it says, being a long-range gun, while also being quiet, which in of itself is very handy as you don't need to craft silencers, it just always is. It doesn't take long to reach the tall round building. You make your way inside and continue to fight the Rattlers. They're pretty much the exact same as any other human enemy type in the game, with their only difference being their use of body armor and assault rifles across the board. They're a little more tough, but not a ton. We do get to see something interesting though, as the Rattlers use infected held by chains as guards. I didn't mention this earlier, but we can actually play around with this, letting infected loose to deal with enemies rather than go at them ourselves. Ellie keeps making her way up the building until eventually we come across some people held within one of the cells. Abby isn't present, but the group tells us she had tried to escape and is currently being held down at the beach in the Pillars. They also state she's most likely already dead, but nonetheless we head down regardless. As we reach the coast, we see exactly why they called this place the Pillars. Bodies upon bodies have been hung up on the stakes, left to starve and die. We take a quick glance around and find Abby? She looks way different, with a shorter haircut and having such poor health she looks almost unrecognizable. She recognizes it's Ellie, but beyond that stays pretty silent. Ellie cuts her down, which Abby immediately takes as an opportunity to get Lev down too, and it's nice to see him still alive, as he took quite the beating before with the Rattlers. I was somewhat worried. The three head further down shore where Abby knows some boats lie, and at first it seems they're going to be going their separate ways. Ellie's getting ready to leave, but endures another flashback of Joel's death. Ellie says to Abby,
I can't let you leave.
and forces her to fight. While Abby at first denies, she gives in as Ellie threatens to kill Lev otherwise. The two begin to brawl, and it's about as Naughty Dog of a fight as you can get. It plays very similarly to previous fights in the game, or even duels in Uncharted, with only dodging and attacking to worry about in the most simplest of ways. And that's one thing I will criticize this game for. Much like Naughty Dog's other cover shooters, the boss fights are pretty much non-existent and feel so shallow. I understand it might be hard to develop or come up with ideas to make interesting fights while also keeping realism at play, but when you're one of gaming's biggest and most renowned developers, the climax and final fight in your games should be more than just pressing square when the game tells you to. I'm not discrediting the actual battle, as I don't think some grand final fight needed to take place. They're both very hurt, and struggling to fight in the water fits extremely well, but this whole thing could have easily been a cutscene, and that sucks. Things eventually turn to Ellie having the advantage. She's drowning Abby, who then bites off two of her fingers, but Ellie keeps holding her down, and it really seems as if she's about to go through with her revenge. That is, until she has another flashback of Joel, this time being him on his deck playing guitar. Ellie lets go of Abby and just sits in the water telling her to
Take him.
Now, besides Joel's death, this is where I see a lot of people getting angry with the storytelling in this game. From what I can see, people either wanted Ellie to get revenge or thought the game was too heavily pushing the message of revenge isn't good, with many saying, duh, we obviously know that. I personally don't recognize either of those statements, and I don't think Naughty Dog was trying to push a revenge isn't good narrative anyways. The big thing I see and take discourse with is those who wanted Ellie to get revenge or are upset because she forgave Abby. First things first, she doesn't forgive Abby. She's just done with it all. In fact, she's been done for a while now, and if you read the journal entries, she even asks herself why she's there. The only reason Ellie is truly here now is because of Tommy. She felt pressured to, and she herself knows this won't solve anything or bring back Joel. Ellie would much rather be at home with Dina and Jesse, and while some may say, why didn't she stay in the first place, emotions can make people act on things they otherwise wouldn't when level-headed. Another thing I see people complain about is how Ellie only realized this wouldn't solve anything at this point, after she had already killed hundreds, even thousands of lives. Leading up to the battle in the theater, Ellie never had that thought. She didn't care who she killed along the way, as Abby was her end goal. In the third act, however, she had this new belief the whole way through, and while she may have struggled at points with it, her true feelings always stuck around. Sure, she may have killed a bunch of rattlers in this last stretch, but they were shitty people all around, and if the setting had been different, I doubt she would have killed innocent people without a reason at this point in her journey. Now, about wanting Ellie to get revenge. I just find that plain stupid. Some are upset and claim that Abby got her revenge, it's unfair Ellie doesn't get hers. Are you serious? Sure, Abby did get her revenge, but at what cost? Abby lost just about everyone she cared for as a result of her actions, with the only exception being Lev. She surely didn't win or get a better outcome than Ellie by any means. There's something I think about and look back to often with this game, and that's at the start when Ellie tells Tommy,
If it were you or me, Joel would be halfway to Seattle already.
and that's absolutely true. We know Joel's character, and that's exactly what he would do, but in this situation, if Joel had his way, I would say it's very likely he would not want Ellie to go down the same path. He cares about her too much and would not want to put her life on the line for something so meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Joel probably would have done these exact same actions if the roles were reversed, but I think Ellie's realized that's not at all what he would want for her, and that's why she gave up and let Abby go in the end. After a solid 10 seconds or so of a black screen, we turn back to the farm. We see Ellie, with her fingers missing, readying herself to enter what was once her home again. Things are quiet, and it's clear Dina and JJ had moved out long ago, and I mean, can you blame her? How do you expect Dina to raise JJ alone so far off from anyone else with practically no help? Ellie heads upstairs to the art room and grabs the guitar Joel gave her. She tries, but now with her damaged hand, she can no longer play any of the songs Joel taught her. We now see one last flashback, a continuation of what Ellie had remembered during her fight with Abby. Ellie approaches Joel after the events that took place at the dance, and they talk about a few things. Ellie mentions how she had the Seth situation under control, the two talk about Dina, with it all leading up to Ellie bringing up the hospital again. Joel responds with,
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
To which Ellie says,
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
she says I'll see you around, and they go their separate ways, and even just thinking about it now I'm tearing up. I love this moment. It's the last time with each other they get, and whilst devastating it gets cut short, it's bittersweet with Ellie saying she'd like to work on their relationship. Back in the present, Ellie rests her guitar against the window, grabs her bag, and heads out. As Beyond Desolation begins to kick in, the camera zooms in alongside Ellie's guitar, and peering out the window, we see her walk off into the woods alone, leaving the farmhouse and everything within behind. The credits roll, but beyond that there is one small detail left. The title screen changes from what we now know as the boat by the pillars to that same boat having reached Catalina Island, implying that indeed, Abby and Lev made their way to the Fireflies. Before I end off this video, I'd like to tell a quick story that may or may not sway you into believing I had bias when it comes to this game. As I'd mentioned at the start of the video, I only played The Last of Us for the first time very recently, and while I loved the game, I might have done it in not such a great way. You see, I was streaming my first playthrough. I know, I was way too naive. But all was going well for the first while. I had people come in and help me with parts I was stuck on, and I was having a blast. That was until something not so great happened. At this point, I had heard about all the controversy going on with Part 2 and how some saw and hated the spoilers, but had yet to see them myself. As I was streaming, someone came into my chat with the username Joel Kills Ellie The Last of Us 2, and yeah, my day was pretty much ruined. I completely understood why everyone was so frustrated and had these intense feelings. I could not comprehend how that could even be a possibility. I was mad, and from that point forward stopped streaming my playthrough, but I never actually went out and searched for the real spoilers. Leading up to The Last of Us Part 2, I was really excited, but I genuinely thought these were the spoilers everyone had been talking about, as it made sense to be mad over. Then when I played the game, that obviously wasn't true, and I didn't understand why everyone hated it so much. I would have been in total agreement if the fake spoilers I heard were true, but when it comes down to it, I loved Part 2's story. The Last of Us Part 2 is in my eyes one of the greatest games ever created. I wasn't just some diehard Last of Us fan either, as I only recently got into the series. In almost every regard, I think this game knocks the first out of the park. The storytelling, writing, presentation, music, and especially gameplay, easily surpasses the first title, but that's also just my opinion. I completely respect and understand if you hated the game, but I'd appreciate if you look at those of us who enjoy the game the same way. Us as a community shouldn't be so arrogant towards one another, and that goes for both sides, or even when it comes to the opinion of any game. We need to chill the out on Twitter wars and dislike bombing each other's videos, and recognize it's completely valid to hold any opinion on this game. It's literally entertainment. With all that said, I give The Last of Us Part 2 a 9.5 out of 10. Enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you next time.